So the question was about ghosts and beings and whether they can communicate with us or not. Non-human beings, to be specific. And that depends on several factors, the way I understand it. It has to do with oneself, your own ability to perceive different fluctuations of, of energy, of experience, as well as the entities itself. Meaning, if it is a Peta or a hungry ghost we're talking about, then there are beings who have really strongly attached themselves to certain experiences and specifically certain locales, certain environments. And usually this means where they were prior to their death, or how long they lived, and what kind of uh, experiences they had while being alive. And that means not something necessarily gruesome or bad, like in the case of a homicide or somebody who has been brutally killed, savagely treated or beaten, and the person uh, being locked inside those heavy emotions of anger, loss, being completely alone, defenseless, vulnerable, being exposed to such hardship. It is no surprise that some beings, because of their attachment to those very strong emotions and the strong sense of identity, which is crucial here, and it doesn't just stay with the Peta realm, it goes to other realms as a common denominator, the sense of identification. So in that instance, we're given this example of a person being, let's say, brutally treated and dying. That person will become stamped with that emotion so strongly that they will see that location where that took place as the place where they can and they will reside in their minds as eternity. But fortunately, there's no such thing as eternity as such, even for suffering. Eventually, they will come to a point, or the effects of that rebirth into that state, that transmigration into that state, in this case the Peta example, even that will run out. Now, that can take many, many years, in fact centuries in some cases, if not more, depending on the person's adherence and glue-like attachment to this is what happened to me. By the way, the person is suffering because they are completely overwhelmed and secretly enjoying that pain because they don't see anything else. And that also is like, we can use the example of anger, severe anger, where it almost becomes like enjoyable. If you've ever had a very strong itch and you want to scratch it, if you don't be careful, you're going to scratch it until it bleeds. Even while bleeding, sometimes really, I've seen people, I used to do it when I was a child, when I used to get like, I think, I don't know if it was smallpox or something. It was like very, very um, um, painful. It needed to be scratched. But I didn't stop until I saw how badly I was exasperated. Situation. I was just making it worse. Excuse me. So it's similar to that. It becomes enjoyable. Meanwhile, the person is getting more and more miserable. So they have a lot of sadness, they have a lot of pain and anger, depending again on the person's attachment to those emotions that they experienced right at the end of their life as a human being, let's say. Now, when you are dealing with sadness, by the way, sadness could also be it. Let's say sadness, a person who had wonderful experiences in that place. Let's say a father figure or mother figure living in a huge mansion where she or he saw so many of her generations come and go, where there were so many parties, but she died hoping for those memories to be re-enlivened, repeat themselves, but they never do. So she's attached to, refusing, in fact, to admit to the fact that there is anicca, impermanence. So this gives, but deep down she wants to move on, but she can't. So she holds on to those memories. They themselves become the shackles that keep the person stuck there. Now, depending on the intensity of the bond, so-called shackles, and especially the craving that the person still has, they might be able to cause certain things to happen in the location. Maybe moving certain things, even sounds, shaking, even physical sensations to cause on the beings, for the beings who are there, let's say the human beings. Other beings, like such as animals, they could see them. And if you go into deep meditation, you would be able to, or attain certain levels of jhanas, you would be able to see them as well. So that it doesn't become so opaque anymore. You see it, it's a lot more transparent. But they are essentially powerless when it comes to causing major harm. Now, if the person, a living human being, let's say, is exposed to witnessing some of these things, rarely do you find a person who's coming in with an empty slate, meaning they already have their own fears and things about ghosts and things. So it's not necessarily the ghost that does that to the person, like scaring them or anything. It's their own fears that they bring to the table as such. So, oh my God, this is going to happen. So they don't have a settled mind. And they definitely, if they don't have a settled mind, they don't have metta in their hearts. Loving kindness, which, by the way, is like medicinal balm, medicinal ointment for these beings who are suffering. Because first of all, they never probably experienced love. And that person, that elderly being in their last life who's holding on to the memories, to the walls of this mansion, trying to repeat as the mansion is crumbling. You give them a sense of hope suddenly, because you give them that love that they always were craving, which had taken place years or centuries even ago when they were gathered with their loved ones. But you, the person who just came into the scene, into their home, by giving her or him love, loving kindness, and transferring your merits to them, saying, may you truly find peace. That's something they don't get. Probably they haven't gotten, 24/7 for centuries. As they were skulking around in those empty walls, always replaying the same old stories. It's torture for them. So now, though, the doors of love opens up to them. That is one way to really give them a soothing sensation where they can calm down. The mind can settle. They might not know what's happening, but they really will enjoy it. And usually, all they need, if they have the necessary merits, if they have undergone, let's say, the balance is run out of whatever that was that caused them to be reborn in a lower state like that, of confusion, of disarray, that loving kindness that you're projecting to them, radiating to them, can be enough for them to be nudged out of that existence into a higher existence. And some of them can go straight into a Deva realm. Imagine, from hell. It's a hellish experience, being in a Peta, a hungry ghost, where you don't have food, you're going around hungry, feeding yourself on the repetition series of a chain of repetitive memories that make you feel even more suffering, pain, disarray. So that's another reason why especially we practice loving kindness, because in the Janusoni Sutta, in the Anguttara Nikaya, Lord Buddha says this very clearly about who it is that is basically the best candidates to receive our merits. And after Janusoni goes, how about our departed loved ones, this and that, and Lord Buddha says, well, if your departed loved ones happen to be born as an animal or as a human being, there's a lot of there's many restrictions, and sometimes they won't even get it. So you can almost tell Janusoni, who was a lay follower, who was a very big supporter of the Sasana, kind of feel depressed, about his own relatives and things. And then Lord Buddha says, don't worry, there's other people's relatives, even if your relatives have moved on from the Peta realm or from the hungry ghost realm. And Janusoni says, well, what do you mean, Bhante? And he says, the realm of hungry ghosts, like all the other realms, will never run out of its inhabitants. There's always some limitless amounts of beings being reborn into those realms, individual respective realms, and specifically the Peta realms, the hungry ghosts, where a person is reborn, and unfortunately, when you're stuck there, sometimes for a long time, depending on your karma, that group of beings, let's say, who used to be relatives of someone who was alive now, who was very much aware, and maybe even they were offering food and incense or to them, candle, medicinal liquids, etc., that we usually offer at the altar with the Lord Buddha's statue, and have a moment of transferring those merits and sharing them with the loved ones. So even if these hungry ghost relatives who are now dead and gone, many of these Petas will still find merits being sent to them if you keep transferring merits. So even though they're not your relatives, basically, they will still find comfort and solace and respite in knowing that they are not forgotten. Otherwise, imagine how painful that becomes. When you know that your relatives are not on this planet anymore and you are still hovering. Now that person, imagine again the image I gave you of the person who was roaming around their house, mansion. Imagine all your loved ones are dead and gone. And they're not moved on to a different realm. And they're not Petas, they're not hungry ghosts. So you're completely alone on a planet where you don't have any relatives. relatives that were confined in space and time. And in this case, time is a big factor, because you're not going to be having anybody on the planet who will think of you. And that is very important for the Peta to feel satiated, protected, loved, cared for, offered something. Because if the memory is gone, so is the sustenance. And that's why in some cultures they always offer do donations, offerings, put some food on the side for their elders and ancestors. So that gives the beings a sense of comfort that they're not forgotten, even though they don't recognize anyone. And they themselves are not recognizable. Now, some people are going to think, oh, this is just, some type of nonsense, old, traditional or ethnic or something that was highly culturally influenced into Buddhism, but it's not. And those are the people who fall short of really appreciating the depth of the Dhamma and their own experience. Because the meditation can allow a person to go ahead and taste these things and see them for themselves. Taste in the sense that they become a lot clearer, and you don't need anybody to tell you or convince you of these things. And the Peta realms are just one example, because there's other realms too. There are other realms. But this one I wanted to address because I don't want to go on talking about this for a long time. These realms are very very important to have in our minds, because they're suffering. Because sometimes when I teach metta, sometimes I get students who say, well, who should I send it to now? After the stages, I see them progressing, so I have to change and tweak their practice. So when it comes to a point where they need to massively radiate it to the different directions, for example, they have a hard time associating with the destination, the receiving end of their metta, basically. How will this affect? Who will this affect? Who is it directed towards, targeting, basically? And knowing the Petas, they are the best recipients of our metta. Because if you're sending it to your friends on the other side of the planet, or loved ones, they're already going through their own living experiences. So they really need to be on a deep meditative level, or in some level of synchronicity, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, in order for them to feel a nudge. And they do. What was that? I'm feeling so good. So if they sit into deep meditation, go into a level of jhana, for example, or intuitive awareness of the heart opening up, they will feel, and they will know somebody's sending them metta. They're getting metta in truckloads. Where is this coming from? But that's a rare occurrence. Otherwise, the human beings that you send metta to, at best they might feel fuzzy inside in their heart, feel good, but they don't know what's happened. And in most cases, they won't even feel it, unless the person who's sending it is a very powerful generator of metta. However, so it's a they don't necessarily feel it 100%. That's what I'm trying to say. If it's a human being, even if it's a deva, depending on the level of the deva. But when it comes to petas, they will definitely feel it. Definitely. And they will be moved, because that's something unusual for them to receive. So even if you do have petas who are unable to move things, to influence things, you can definitely move their world, which is even more important. They can be moved by your love. Loving kindness, to be specific. And that gives them a sense of freedom also. In fact, not just a sense, but in reality, that can also set them free from that realm. Because you gave them a glimpse of the Brahma Viharas in that miserable state, even with empty tummies. And another thing I didn't mention was greed. Greed is also another strong defilement. It's one of the three poisons. The first, in fact, lobha, greed or lust, wanting things. Especially people who are hoarders, very rich people, or people who are so attached to things they don't want to let go of, they also become petas. And we have stories, one particular story, I think it was in the Majjhima Nikaya, Middle Discourses, where, I forgot the Brahmin's name, but basically he used to taunt Lord Buddha every time Lord Buddha was passing on his alms round in front of his mansion. And he would just, basically it was like shooing people, like, go, shoo, get out of here, go away, you bald-headed beggars, things like that. So he was very, very disrespectful. So he lost tremendous amounts of, very many opportunities, shall we say. And he dies. But he was so wealthy, he didn't want to share his food. And he dies. But because he's so attached to his home, his own wealth, and his own mansion, he ends up being reborn as one of the pups in the house of the mother, the dog, basically. So he ends up being one of those pups. So he ends up being a dog. And later on, sometime later, Lord Buddha is still passing in front. And now, this Brahmin, now reborn as a dog, is continuing to harass Lord Buddha by barking. Now it's so crystal clear to Lord Buddha as to who this person is, of course. And he calls him out and he says, Brahmin, you used to yell at me, taunt me as I passed in front of you. Now you're barking at me, nothing's changed. You're still barking, as you did when you were a human being, trying to harass and not give and not be generous. What has all that barking and yelling left you with? And the dog becomes so ashamed in hearing this, and that it goes and curls up in the back, I think the corner of the house. And now the servants, the servant lady, or the slaves who are in the house, they see what happened. They saw the interaction. And now they go and tell the owner's son, who's now the lord of the mansion. And he's very troubled by this, that how can a holy man, a recluse, the recluse Gautama, they weren't Buddhists, how can somebody of such an high esteem, respect in the society, say such a derogatory and insulting thing to a Brahmin family, especially my father's legacy? Because the wound apparently was still fresh on the son, that he lost his dad. But so he goes to Lord Buddha and he says, with all due respect, I think there was an error on your part. I wanted to clear it up with you to see, And he says, of course I'm paraphrasing here. I forget names so much, so I can't remember the name of them, but it's unmistakably there. So in the suttas, so it'll come to me. And Lord Buddha explains to him in this way. So he gives him a brief Dhamma talk, but he was very matter of fact, Lord Buddha, in his teachings, and he would always see what level the person was on. And he saw that this young man was ready to understand, but he needed proof, obviously. So he gives him some series of steps to go and Well, first of all, I think he says there's a portion of the wealth that's missing, isn't there? And the young man completely is baffled because nobody knew about this. Because after the father's death, they checked and saw that, in fact, there's a big chunk of the treasure from the treasure house that's not there. But the dad is dead and gone, so who are they going to ask? No one, so it's lost. But so they kept it in the family, no one talked about it. Until now, Lord Buddha is mentioning this. So he really has, now his ears are perked up, he's definitely listening to what Lord Buddha is saying. And he says, go ahead and do this. So I think he says, go and fill up like a plate of food for the dog. And then you go ahead and, I think he says, put some salt in there or something like that. And basically for the dog to eat and really lounge in that delicious, luxurious food. And he says, afterwards you go and the dog is resting. You go ahead and you whisper in its ears, Father, where did you bury the treasure? And just stand aside and follow the dog. Just carefully follow the dog from afar. And you'll see where the treasure is. And now with excitement the young man goes and does the thing that Lord Buddha says, and then he ends up seeing the dog, go and start digging under a specific tree all the way in one of their fields. Lo and behold, there's the treasure, and there's his father, who was always barking down the hall. So this is an interesting story that has, it's lovely to indicate the relevancy of what we think with people, how they thought back then. Because we think, oh, these things don't happen, these are just mumbo jumbo, these are nonsensical things, added elements later, into the Dhamma or Sasana. That's not true. These realms do exist. The suttas are full of them, and they do have a role to play in the Dhamma. They're not like unnecessary elements that we can get rid of in modern so-called secular Buddhism or something like that. There's no such thing, first of all. It's either Buddhism or it's not. It's either Buddhism or it's not. It's either the Dhamma or it's not. It's either Dhamma or Adhamma. So if I'm cherry picking what I think is supposed to be the Dhamma or out of the Dhamma and making my own version and giving it another title, that's actually misrepresenting Lord Buddha's teachings, and that is accruing for me a tremendous amount of bad kamma vipaka, whether I believe in them or not, by the way. Okay, so which I find to be another level of superlative conceit within the person. But it can be enough so that can drive such a person, who otherwise would call themselves very good practicing Buddhists, into the realm of the hungry ghosts, by the way, or the animal realms, which is, for both of these realms specifically, ignorance is a key factor. Ignorance, conceit, animals, betas, or hungry ghosts. So it's a major drop-off. It's like from a status of a human being who has the potential to become an arahant, who even came close, really close to the Dhamma, practiced it to some extent, or understood some concepts, let's say, and missed the whole boat. So we need to be careful from conceit, from greed, from anger, because they come from delusion. The third of the defilements, which is moha, and that is drenched in conceit, because throughout the person's lifetime they've always come across teachings, examples, from their own lives, which they have deliberately avoided looking at carefully, because of some anger that they've had about something, not willing to let go and experience. Fear, perhaps. So that's why when we come to the Dhamma, we need to always work to relinquish our own previous ideas of what it is supposed to be, and really open and keep an open status in the heart, in the mind. And that is the thing which also allows you to give, to share metta, and to also develop in your own practice. You have that, you will not fall into the lower realms. Because sooner than later, if you are able to maintain such a pure state of awareness as you are persevering, as you're keeping your sila, as you're practicing your bhavana, your samadhi, your mental cultivation, properly, adhering to the suttas, listening to Dhamma talks, pondering, thinking, trying to understand, remembering a certain verse, something that has touched you, again and again and again, making that your tool that you keep going back to throughout the day. The day will come, if you're doing it right, if you have a teacher and you're following the directions properly without changing anything, the day will come where the eye of Dhamma will open up. And what that means is you have crossed, you have passed the point of no return. Now the four lower realms are history for you. There's no way you're going to fall into those realms, including the animal realms, including the hell realms, including the asura realms, including the peta realms, hungry ghosts. There's no way you fall into that. So these are not just scary deterrents for us. Oh, you're going to fall into that. No, these do exist. But my job is not to convince you, of course. My mission is to help you to understand the value of the life that you already have right now and what you can do with it, so we don't fall into those realms of pain and sorrow and delusion. So there's a lot you're able to do now. So get going. So I hope that answers your question. Wonderful. May you all be well.